one thing we know by the two Hebrew words being dealt with, the two key Hebrew words being dealt with in this passage in Jeremiah 17:9, is that it can't possibly mean that man he has a heart that's deceitful and desperately wicked. So the idea of being a nosh or a nash is that this heart of man has a malady, not sin, but a weakness. Paul described it pretty good, didn't he, in Romans 7? He said he described this battle where when he would do good, evil was present with him, and what he wanted to do, he didn't do, and what he didn't want to do, he did. And there's this frailness to function properly, and this vacillation, this winding and bumpiness in the heart. Now, what's interesting is that Hebrew word that gets translated desperately wicked. Let's be concordant about it. Let's look at a couple places that this Hebrew word is translated in the Old Testament and see if desperately wicked works good. For one great example is Job 34:6. And Job says that his wound, he has a physical wound, and that it's incurable. He said, my wound is anash. It's incurable. So are we supposed to assume that Job had a desperately wicked wound? Is it talking about a moral issue? Or is he just saying, man, I'm really sick. This wound has weakened me. This wound has made me sick and frail and feeble. Something Paul would talk about, the body of our humiliation. Just our mortality. Another great place it's used is in 2 Samuel 12:15, talking about David's child. And it says that he was very sick, very anash. He was very frail and weak and feeble and mortal, and his young son died. It doesn't mean that David's newborn baby was desperately wicked. It is not morality at all, or having any bearing on a moral compass, but just with this idea of being sick and frail and weak and mortal. And it took him right out. So this is beautiful. All we got to do is be concordant about it. All we got to do is be consistent with the translation of the word. And so Jeremiah 17:9 is speaking about a human condition, the condition of the human heart that is windy and bumpy and frail and mortal and weak. So we might purpose something in our heart, but we are too weak to accomplish it. We can't carry it out. That's a far cry from being sinful. That's a far cry from being evil. That's a far cry from being desperately wicked. My Baptist days, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. That's what you are. You're sickening to God. All your evil and corruption. And and just presenting it in a sinful, moral tone. And this can't be what either one of these words would point to. So the idea here is that the human heart is tricky. In fact, what's really interesting is this word translated deceitful, again, which is crooked or waving or bumpy. That word is the root word behind the word Jacob, who was the trickster. So the point is, the human heart's real tricky. You got to be careful with the human heart. It can lead you astray, not because it's desperately wicked, but because it's mortal and frail and weak. It has an infirmity, and it may not be reliable. It may be to the left one day, to the right one day. And when you see this, what a beautiful. So it speaks of being tricky or hard to track, hard to know what it's doing next. And so it speaks to the idea of instability, of complexity, of unpredictableness. Now, interestingly, now let me read you the concordant. I'll read you the King James again. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Concordant says, the heart is crooked above all things and is mortally ill. So it's sick. It's not doing well. The heart of Adam's descendants is not doing well. But another translation, which to me takes this to a even greater understanding, is the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. It's sometimes identified as the LXX, the 70, having to do with those who were translating it. But so what happened in the 3rd century, 300 years before Christ came on the scene? The Jews translated the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek. And that translation's the Septuagint. Now, what's interesting about the Septuagint, and most folks probably don't realize, is the Septuagint is older than any complete Hebrew manuscript in existence. So it's actually the older source. So 300 years before Christ, the Jews translated the Hebrew Scripture manuscripts they had available, and they translated them into Greek. And this is the oldest complete Hebrew manuscript, or in this case, Greek translation of a Hebrew manuscript in existence. And we're not talking about by a little bit. Now, there are fragments of older manuscripts, but we're talking about complete. And what's interesting here is that, again, it's the older manuscript by a lot. We're talking 1,000 years older than any other manuscript from the Old Testament Scripture, from the Hebrew Scriptures. Let me read to you how the Septuagint translates this verse. And it's very interesting. It translates it this way: the heart is deep above all things, It is the man, and who can know him? The Septuagint reframes the verse to be discussing not the windiness of the human heart, but how complex and deep it is, that it's beyond knowledge. So instead of making what can be known it, the heart, it becomes the man. So man's heart is complicated, so much so, and it is the man. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So our hearts are so complicated. Who can know them? Who can know us? Now, the Greeks set off to fix this, right? Know thyself. Well, Jeremiah already says the heart's too complex for that. Who can know it? And by the way, that framing of the translation best matches the very next words of the next verse, which says, the King James, I'll read it first. The very next phrase in verse 10, the very next verse says, I, the Lord, search the heart. Or the concordance says, I, Yahweh, investigate the heart. And the Septuagint says, the heart is deep above all things, and it is the man, and who can know him? I, the Lord, try the heart.